I'd like to welcome everyone to the launch of a new report titled Leveraging AI for Democracy, Civic Innovation on the New Digital Playing Field, that's being released by the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. We're here to discuss the critical issue of developing a positive pro-democratic vision for artificial intelligence, and specifically how civil society can help design AI tools that work better for democracy. Rapid progress is changing the landscape of possibilities when it comes to what we can do with AI technologies. Societies around the globe are still working to understand what this means for everyday lives, from jobs to education to media. One thing that's come to be widely understood, however, is that we can't take AI's impact on democracy for granted. In the decades since the early 2010s, when we spoke optimistically about liberation technology, there's been a wider recognition that digital advances don't automatically advance democracy. When designed and used in ways that go against democratic values, digital tools can easily bolster authoritarian actors in their quest to surveil and manipulate global publics, control the flow of information, and clamp down on civic space. We already see AI tools being used to undermine democracy, whether in the form of deep fakes produced by AI audio generators in Slovakia, or facial recognition systems used to arrest anti-war protesters in Russia. The Chinese authorities are pioneering a full-fledged digital authoritarian model that prioritizes manipulation and control as an alternative to open civic engagement and debate. And this approach to AI is proving to be tempting to government officials, even in more open political settings. There's no silver bullet when it comes to guarding against these risks. In our past work, we've explored how to deepen our understanding of digital authoritarian threats and enable democratic conversations about AI governance. But it's equally important to think about how to equip pro-democratic actors to compete on the new digital playing field. How can we make sure that independent journalists, civic leaders, human rights monitors are in the best possible position to take advantage of new digital tools? This isn't a straightforward question. With the development of cutting-edge models concentrated in a handful of companies, civil society faces asymmetries of resources, capacity, and information when it comes to designing AI tools, or even fully understanding how they operate. Commercial tools aren't always optimized to handle the requirements of public interest work. Looking ahead to another wave of transformative technological change, it's critical to think about how we can better share knowledge from organizations on the cutting edge and support effective civil society involvement in AI design. More than just transforming the pro-democracy work we're already doing, we also need to consider new directions in civic life that may open up as our technological capabilities evolve. The exceptional civic tech community in Taiwan, for instance, has led the way in envisioning fundamentally new approaches to online democratic deliberation. Taking stock of digital threats to democracy is crucial, but while the authoritarian digital logics that emphasize deception, coercion, atomization, may feel deceptively compelling from the inside, civil society technologists show us these trajectories are neither logical nor inevitable. The democracy community can't allow digital framings imposed from the outside or drawn by default from the past to construct our range of vision for the future. Instead, it's critical to have faith in our core democratic values and our ability to carve a different path, drawing on insights from different settings and sectors to widen our vision of what's possible. That's why it's so important to reflect on strategies that will create an environment that facilitates mutual learning, support, and resilience in the face of deepening challenges to democracy globally, and why it's critical to continue conversations like the one we're having today. And I'm so pleased we're doing so. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our team, Maya Recanati, John Engelken, Amaris Ranci, and in particular, Beth Kerley, for her leadership on this effort. And now I'm pleased to hand things over to Beth.
Thanks so much, Chris. So I'm delighted to welcome you for a conversation. As Chris mentioned, launching a new essay series from the International Forum. This is the outgrowth of a virtual and then especially a hybrid workshop that we've held, bringing together, as we do here in the forum, practitioners and researchers at the cutting edge of technology and democracy to think about what it would look like to craft a positive pro-democratic vision for AI. So the authors that we have here with us today represent two different ways of thinking about that challenge. We will be thinking about how we can build AI into the existing work of civil society organizations to open up new directions. And we're also going to be talking about what it might look like to leverage new AI capabilities to explore fundamentally new forms of public participation and new directions in civic life. For further information, I would highly encourage everyone to read the full essay series, Leveraging AI for Democracy, which was launched by the forum this morning. But for now, I am delighted to turn it over to our participants. So we have with us today Fernanda Campagnucci, who is a data governance expert and former executive director of Open Knowledge Brasil, currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Munster. Carl Miller, who is founder of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos and author, among other things, of The Death of the Gods, The New Global Power Grab. And my wonderful colleague, Dan O'Malley, who is Director for Technology and Democracy here at NED. So the first question, we'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and then opening it up to audience participation. So I also highly encourage all of you, as we're speaking, to be thinking of questions you might have and enter those in the chat. So Carl, your essay for this collection focuses on AI applications in the sphere of deliberative technologies, which you define as systems designed to enable people to discuss, consider, and ultimately decide at scale and over distance. So recently, a few of the major AI companies sponsored projects to run deliberations with the help of their large language models, one of which you helped to run. So where can AI be helpful in helping large groups of people to discuss issues and make decisions? And how are we seeing these kinds of deliberative technologies applied in AI governance and beyond?
All right, well, thank you, Beth, and good morning. Probably good morning to most people here. So thanks so much for virtually having me. What an important discussion that we're having now. Yeah, so the kind of deliberations that I'm mainly interested in and that I think will be most important are deliberations, which basically just means people talking to one another, which we can plug directly into democratic processes. So that might be policies or regulation or law, which gets kind of rolled out at some level of government, be that local government, national government, multilateral institutions, something else. But that's kind of one of the most formal uses of political power. And there, I think we've actually are having quite a lot of ideas and seeing quite a lot of opportunities where AI really can make deliberations more powerful and easier to do, more straightforward and cheaper. So they might help equip people, firstly, actually with being better able to navigate the kind of thicket of documents and precedent and legal and policy considerations. There's actually, whenever you run a deliberation like that, is always one of the most difficult things to bring hundreds, if not thousands of people along with you into. There's always so many different considerations. And there you might use AI, for instance, to kind of pull all the documents into one place, to summarize them, and to actually then generate kind of briefings and other things which you can use to help normal people that you've brought into the deliberation actually make sense of the terrain that they're trying to make decisions within. Secondly, you might use AI to construct different information spaces that deliberation occurs within. This is probably where we've already seen the kind of greatest success. Chris already mentioned the hackers of Taiwan. Central to the policy process that they built was a platform called Polis, which used AI to make an absolutely kind of pivotal little tweak in engineering, where instead of surfacing information on the basis of, say, how much emotional arousal it was generating or how much attention it could capture, instead, it was surfacing statements on the basis of how consensual they seemed to be. And that completely transformed the discuss environment. Suddenly, discussions were kind of coughing up all these consensus items, one after the other, which could be used to make law. And that's just the beginning. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways and you can re-engineer information environments to do things similar to that or to do other things which are interesting to deliberation. And then lastly, probably in how you actually understand and generate the outputs of deliberation. So one of the things that we've learned over many years of trying to do this at Demos is that you don't really do, one deliberation is never really enough to actually practically make law. Like quite often you're having to move from, wide discussions with thousands of people to generate ideas, but then you often have to narrow it down into a much more focused kind of discussion where you're actually then hammering out specific tangible policy agendas. Then you go wide again, you get everyone's views. Then you go back down narrow to smaller group. And that kind of undulating nature of moving between wide and narrow forms of discussion, that really is what you have to try and create somehow if you want to create law and policy. And there AI might be really helpful as well, because we can summarize discussions, we can map them out, we can create really, really understandable kind of outputs that people can use. So those are three different kinds of layers in which AI is kind of already being applied in one way or another. And I'm sure there's going to be many more in the kind of months and years ahead. This is like an area now of like extremely active and I think quite exciting experimentation.
Thanks so much, Carl. So I really appreciate that overview of very concrete ways in which AI can help people be more prepared for deliberations, can change the way deliberations are run, and can synthesize those outputs into slightly more actionable takeaways. And as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about takeaways from workshops, this is a very interesting point to me. I also want to flag, I found it quite intriguing in your essay that in addition to kind of incorporation in formal democratic processes, you mentioned potential applications of these technologies for membership organizations and social movements as well to kind of discuss and arrive at a consensus among members. Fernanda, turning now to you. So you've spent the past 5 years as executive director at Open Knowledge Brasil, which has done some really pioneering work in using AI to help the public make sense of government data and hopefully ensure that citizens have the information they need to do a better job of holding their governments accountable. So tell us a little bit about how AI is being used by Open Knowledge, kind of the evolution in that space, and perhaps any examples from the open government community more broadly.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Beth, for your question and for the invitation. I'm excited to see the report coming to light. So one of the most relevant experiences we had in Brazil, which is still a reference in the field of civic innovation in Latin America to this day, was the project known as Serenata de Amor, or Love Serenade. It started as a spontaneous project in the open source and civic hacker community in 2016 and was later absorbed into the Open Knowledge Brasil infrastructure and team. So Serenata had two main components. At its core, it had a machine learning algorithm that would perform statistical regression on time series data of Congresspeople official spendings. So it would organize and structure the data to make this possible, this analysis possible, and also to make it available in a dashboard for reuse for other purposes, such as journalistic investigations. And there was a second component, and probably the main reason for its huge success at the time, that was this integration with social media. So we had a Twitter bot named Rose, just like the Jetsons cartoon. And the bot would take these paintings that was automatically flagged as suspicious by the algorithm and would tweet about it, mentioning the congressperson handle and asking people to help the bot to check it out. So it drew a lot of media attention. And at that time, now the project is in standby, but it's still being maintained. And the Congress at the time received back a significant amount of irregular spendings, received back these reimbursements. So as a result, people from all over Brazil started asking for a local serenata, so they could oversee local authorities with similar expenditures procedures or procurement and in local legislative chambers and city halls. So this demand is real and is important in Brazil. We have more than 5,500 municipalities with local chambers, city halls, and with autonomy to make their own social investments and expenditures. So it's a huge challenge. But even though this was a fairly straightforward technical problem to solve, and the tech stack was open source libraries, pretty accessible and easy replicable, what was missing, and still is today, is data. So replicating Serenata across the country wasn't possible, not because the technology itself, but because of the lack of open data. So in 2021, Open Knowledge Brasil changed its focus to tackle the bigger picture of data infrastructure. And the only source of data to do that is basically unstructured data scraped from PDFs of daily local gazettes. I described this in more details in the essay. So it has become increasingly easy to process a larger amount of unstructured data, plain text, in search of contracts, specific policies, for instance, climate-related acts, and all sorts of content that these official gazettes bring. But the quality of data and the process for more accurate analysis are still important challenges we can discuss further. And more broadly, in the open governance space, most of the initiatives are basically on the government side now. State controllers and oversight agencies are using AI-based tech to flag suspicious procurement procedures, pretty much like Serenata did, or detecting the involvement of politically exposed persons. And the Senate tech team is starting to use it to classify citizens' demands and distribute them internally. Some independent journalism outlets are experimenting this with large language models, but these are pretty much experimental use cases. So we can explore other angles of this issue, but I think this is a basic overview.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I want to come back later in this conversation to the question of why it may be that more of this is happening on the government side than in civil society, and some of the challenges that civil society organizations in particular face when trying to leverage AI for specific purposes. But really appreciate you bringing out basically how we have this public data out there, but making it more accessible to citizens and kind of flagging, all right, this is where you should look. This might be a sign of a suspicious transaction automatically, rather than just leaving sort of mountains of information there that's really impossible for any individual person or even a small organization to sift through, how that can really be a key value add from AI. Turning to both of these domains, I do want us to think a little bit about how the evolution of AI technology in recent years, and especially the increased capability of AI models to deal with natural language, which of course is one of the areas where LLMs have really changed the game, might allow new ways of thinking about these kinds of approaches to civic deliberation, or to civic engagement. So on both these fronts, kind of just where do you see the game changer at from where we were before? Because civic AI has been around, of course, since well before ChatGPT, well before generative AI was what we were talking about, right? Some of the applications you mentioned, Fernanda, are a very different approach to AI. And so I do want to emphasize that we're not just talking about chatbots, we're not just talking about Gen AI, but as AI evolves in certain directions, new possibilities are opening up. So I'm starting with Carl. Where do you see the possible game-changing effect from increases in AI language processing capabilities.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, and I mean, it's not a field that has ever been boring. I mean, I've been in a team of natural language processing engineers now for 15 years, and like even far before the emergence of GPT and the other LLMs, you know, we never did the same research project twice. In all those years, you know, this is a field that has become kind of unbelievably more powerful and capable from one year to the next. LLMs in particular, though, I do think kind of open up, when it comes to deliberation, some things that we simply couldn't have done before, or certainly not have done in ways which were safe enough and accurate enough to be able to think about being able to integrate into, say, a policy process. The models being interactive is potentially extremely game-changing. So the fact that you can actually discourse with a model, say, around the documents which you have brought into a certain place, show me the ones that have that have an example about this policy being used before. You know, what is the evidence of this policy being either likely to be successful or not? You know, you can imagine that the deliberation participants, people that are trying to get their heads around a whole new area, could constantly be talking to models, you know, using natural language in order to inquire and cut down and filter and sort the kind of document, the evidence and examples and the precedents in ways which would make sense to them and they would need as the deliberation progressed. Machine translation, which, you know, is not necessarily LLM based, but is an extremely important part of natural language processing, that has got unbelievably more capable in recent years. Now, for the first time, we're running projects where we will have the same document in 15 different versions across 15 different languages. You know, so and then each analyst will be analyzing it in whatever language they want. You can imagine now a deliberation basically doing the same thing, where proposals and responses and comments on responses are all happening in a kind of vastly multilingual way. I'm not sure we've quite seen that emerge, but I think that possibility is extremely exciting, especially when you think about how important it is to kind of hold dialogues and deliberations across borders and to try and gain consensuses on issues where multilateral institutions and international law is looking quite thin on the ground at the moment. Now's a moment really where we really do have to engineer consensuses between nations again. And then I think that the last two are almost kind of countervailing of each other. You've both got the kind of a capacity of LLMs to summarize. I kind of mentioned that in my first answer. Their ability to take very large amounts of text, say a long deliberation that's gone on over days, and then kind of reduce that down to much shorter summaries of what was said. That's very powerful, especially when you want to kind of hand the one deliberation to another. So moving from a large group to a smaller group and a large group. Summarization is going to make the deliberations that try and do that much cheaper and easier. So that's about using LLMs to make deliberations quite broad, but also I think the kind of countervailing possibility is also to make deliberations quite narrow. So NLP in general is extremely good at creating categories. It creates categories and groups and clusters on the basis of what people say and what they do. And there might be the possibility of actually kind of creating deliberations where you have actually a very narrow group of people on a very particular issue. I'm thinking about, say, something to do with like service reform that just engages with service users that had particular experiences, say, of the National Health Service here in the UK. Or it might have to do with a hyper-local issue, planning permission around the local park, parking policy around the local roads. And there actually NLP might be able to help us identify the people that should be brought into a very narrow deliberation like that, especially if you think about that connecting in with, say, civic data that a local government might be holding. So there's lots there. You know, the interactivity is one element. I think the analytical prowess of these models is another. And I think that kind of translation, you know, and the ability of actually bringing people across cultures and language barriers into a single discussion is a third.
Great, thank you. So that translation element, hugely important as we think about the possibility of leveraging AI for greater engagement across societies and in multilingual societies. And Fernanda, you mentioned the kind of municipal gazettes being the main data source at the local level of decision-making, specifically in Brazil. and some of the challenges you describe in your essay of working with that data. So what are your hopes in terms of how AI language processing capacities might enable new ways of interacting with information like that that's in a format that might be difficult for older style AI systems to access?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about our movement from Serenata to Querido Diário, or Dear Diary, which represents this hope that LLM, or natural language processing, at first could really help to make sense of a greater mass of data. So, as I mentioned before, we started making this shift in about 2020, and to this new project, Dear Diary, and we start to deal with this highly unstructured data in those gazettes you mentioned. And these are freely written text. There is no particular pattern. For example, there's an announcement of a new contract signed by a city, and the company being hired may be referred by its full business name, trademark, tax registry number, etc. And unities can be described with extended numbers, 1,003 packs of coffee, or other ways. And it's not exclusive from the Brazil situation, but I've seen it. I presented this case in conferences, and I seen similar requests, similar problems being described by Belgium or Switzerland. They have a similar gazettes scheme to publish official data. So we first had to tackle the problem of the format itself, and I also described that in the essay. It was not machine readable. So then we could apply NLP models, and then we have this ocean of data as opposed to the data deserts we had before. So this already represented a change in scale. We could process more data and make these categories crawl we're talking about when NLP is really good for that. But with large language models, we have a greater potential to amplify those efforts even further. We could, with an NLP, we could develop a script to search for company names mentioned in climate change mitigation contracts. But with LLM, we have three more advantages. We can, any user, any person, a citizen can make a simple prompt to ask for information. Second, we have a greater capacity to analyze relationships between entities, and we have ability to summarize these findings also with some quality issues, but we have this ability to summarize this content and to explain and to connect that to other contexts. For example, we could, in this example of searching for company names, we could ask which company was hired to clean a river in all the 400 cities we have comprised in the data set and all the time series, and get a response explaining that which contractor was supposed to do and where, and even identifying an extension to that contract. So there's a clear potential, but that is still not fully realized, and it's not free from risks. So we have to keep trying to implement that, but I see this clear potential.
Thanks very much. So a change in sort of what is a meaningful data source for machine processing purposes, but also perhaps in the sort of flexibility and adaptability of the types of questions you can ask, rather than building one tool that asks kind of the same kind of question of the same kind of data over and over. You can ask queries, the way we sort of would imagine talking to AI technologies if they were having a conversation with us. And then before we close out this round, so Dan, we've heard about a couple of specific directions of innovation with AI for civic purposes. on the accessing public information front and on the holding deliberation. So those are two really interesting directions, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list. And while I know we are not going to have time to put together an exhaustive list on this webinar, you have seen a lot of interesting projects in your position as Director for Tech and Democracy and in your engagement with the wider civic tech and digital rights communities. So what else is out there that's worth paying attention to in terms of innovations with AI by civil society to advance democratic norms?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Beth. And thank you, Fernanda and Carl, also. To hear more detail about the projects that you're working on is really exciting. I will say that every week it seems like we hear a new kind of way that civil society groups, democracy activist groups are using AI. So it's a really interesting space. I'm just going to share a couple that have kind of captured kind of my attention recently, or I think are quite powerful. The first one I want to share is how human rights and democracy advocates are using AI to protect marginalized communities. So the example I'm thinking of is the documentary Welcome to Chechnya, which looks at the challenges LGBTQI plus individuals face in Chechnya. And the documentarians used digital learning to kind of mask the identities of the victims of this repression in Chechnya. So they were able to preserve what looked like a human face, but without revealing who these individuals are because they were targeted. So it was a really interesting way of how you can continue to maintain that human touch that is so important for advocacy while using these new tools to protect individuals. On a kind of a similar front, but quite different, if we move to Venezuela, there's a relatively new news anchor avatars. It's El Pana y la Chama, the friend and the woman. And they're two AI-generated news anchors who give about 4-minute news presentations that are shared on social media. The reason here is similar. Media in Venezuela, especially in the current context, are under significant pressure. They are being harassed by the regime. And so all of the content that is being voiced and presented by these avatars is real journalistic content. But in order to protect the journalists themselves, they're using avatars to get the story out. So it's a way to deal with the kind of media freedom situation in a unique way that still protects journalists. And just across the border in Colombia, we're also seeing kind of an innovative use of natural language processing and among a journalist community. So Cuestión Pública is using what they've developed, their own bespoke model, Odin, which essentially what they're doing is news organizations develop a lot of content over a long period of time. They're following beats, right? And what this does is it identifies what politicians, for example, are trending in conversations on social media in a given day. And then it looks at what has already been published by the organization on that and allows them to then develop draft tweets that can be reviewed by a journalist. So it allows the organization to efficiently take advantage of the content that's already produced to engage with the day's news feed, what people are actually talking about. So if a corruption story with a politician emerges, you can have a whole string of all of the other stories that this news organization has already produced. So I think that's a really interesting way of how we're seeing news organizations also leverage the efficiencies that this can produce. And one bonus issue that I'm going to pick up where Carl left off on translation, because this is something that's going to really have transformative effects, I think, for a number of our partners. Just this year, Google Translate has added 43 languages to Google Translate. They're now up to 243. And the languages, you kind of would have thought they'd already be there. This is Cantonese, Punjabi, Tok Pisin, for example, are now added. And we know that neural machine translation is really generating advances in the ability to create reliable translations for languages for which there's a smaller corpus of data to do this work. It's not just Google. There are a number of organizations that are using AI and machine learning to facilitate this. So I think this is going to have, the example that Carl gave into deliberations is just one element where this is going to be really powerful. We're going to be able to have direct conversations with communities that have typically been isolated because of their the language that they speak. So, just to sum it up, these are just some examples of how I think AI can be transformative and is currently being marshaled by democracy communities in really positive and innovative ways.
Great, thanks so much. Those are some really intriguing projects to follow, and I especially appreciate the examples of using AI video generators, which I think a lot of us think about primarily in terms of deepfakes, right? And in terms of this being an advantage for people who kind of want to mislead and manipulate for actually very pro-human rights ends to protect marginalized groups. I think that's a fascinating example of ways in which that can be more than just a gimmick for those on the pro-democratic side. So that's an overview of some broad directions in terms of what we're talking about when we say leveraging AI for democracy. But I also want to make sure that we get to thinking a little bit about the broader digital design ecosystem, because as Chris mentioned in his opening remarks, I think none of us on this call are thinking quite the same way we were with the advent of social media in the previous decade about this is liberation technology, and automatically we can kind of sit back and let the AI developers do its thing, and freedom will be on the march around the world, right? There are obvious authoritarian applications for many of these same technologies, and they can also undermine civic space in more subtle ways, for instance, by flooding online spaces with AI-generated spam that just makes it more difficult to find real people's opinions or information from verified sources that are so important for democratic engagement. So looking at that ecosystem level, Carl, you've obviously done very extensive work on the democratic risks in our current social media ecosystem. And looking just based on that experience, as we look ahead to the next generation of technologies that are really reshaping the way that people interact with information, what are some of the lessons that we can draw about the importance of proactively engaging in digital design to make tools that are optimized for democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I spend most of my life kind of struggling with this kind of coterie of online harms that's risen, and especially these kind of shadow influence campaigns that kind of both in tactical and long-term ways like seek to really undercut and target democratic institutions, people, processes, and so on. So that was actually one of the nice things about this essay, was that for a rare moment, I could imagine an information space that was actually really good, rather than having to worry about the information spaces that actually we have to live in most of the time. Kind of reflecting on that, though, I mean, I don't want to sound too grandiose, but I really do think that we're kind of living in the middle of this kind of struggle for the kind of soul of the information age. I mean, we could go either way here. This could be remembered as an age, both where people became more informed and where the kind of wash of data led us to better decisions, and very much not that world as well. And there's a kind of triarchy in the middle of that threat. You've got all of our primordial psychologies, and there's not much we can do about that, but we have to know how fragile they are and how confirmation seeking we are, and how easy it is to outrage us. There's a lot that we bring with us from much deeper kind of elemental parts of human history. You've then got these spaces that are beginning that have interacted for decades now with our primordial psychologies, especially because they're desperately trying to keep our attention on them. And then you've got influence campaigns, especially being launched by autocratic adversaries of democracy, that are exploiting both of those merrily and sometimes extremely effectively. And we absolutely have to break that dynamic up if we are going to build information spaces and democracies that are healthy side by side. If there's one element of digital design that I think is more important than any other, it's how information in general gets curated and surfaced across the internet. Attention is more valuable than anything else. Information generation is easy. It's been easy for ages. There's more YouTube videos present now on the internet than there are people in the world. What matters more than anything else is where attention actually sits, where information flows. And for the last 20 years, locked as they are in a desperate battle for commercial survival and success, the basic philosophy that almost every information environment that we live in today has basically had to adopt is to surface information which keeps us on their platforms. And that has led to a succession, a torrent of data and examples and content that we imbibe that largely creates a series of very deep emotional arousal within us, and especially outrage, and especially anger, and especially polarization. That is especially the kind of philosophy that we have to design away. If we can't design away that philosophy, we are never, I think, going to be able to craft information spaces that sit side by side with democracy. I think those two things are going to be unreconcilable. So digital design and democratic design has never been more important. I will briefly end though to say, and this is one of the points made in my essay, democracies are going to have to change too. You know, this isn't just about re-engineering democratic spaces. It's also about re-engineering democracies for the information age. And when that comes to deliberation, that means we have to find opportunity and energy and enthusiasm for political experimentation as much as it means kind of new technologies as well. They're both going to have to change, because the societies that democracies need to govern aren't the societies that existed 20 years ago. They don't have the same pressures, they don't have the same expectations, and they don't need to draft law with anything like the same kind of pace. You know, they need to move faster in order to, democracies that is, in order to remain fit for the information age as well. So we've got that kind of dual kind of and reciprocating kind of pressure that we need to work on, both political design and also digital design at the same time.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it really is crucial to kind of remember, as your words bring out, that there are choices, right, underlying the design of all of the technologies that we interact with. It's not kind of, there's a teleology of, okay, this is how this type of technology has to work. You see the V-Taiwan case that you mentioned earlier with algorithms that foreground consensus as a potentially different way of constructing deliberative platforms. And that's just one example of how thinking at the design level can really perhaps change the opportunities that are out there to proactively encourage not just the passive intake of information and not just confirmation bias, but open civic engagement and participation and dialogue and debate through the technologies that we're exposed to every day. So I'm going to follow up, Dan and Fernanda, with some questions on sort of the challenges around AI use by civil society and how you overcome them. And as you answer these, I hope you might keep in mind some very important questions that we're getting in the Q&A box about the digital divide, how we include people without easy access to AI tools, or perhaps with limited connectivity in general, right, in these endeavors, make sure civic tech doesn't reinforce the digital divide, and generally keep in mind equity concerns as we design AI tools. So just with that as kind of one point to cover, starting with Fernanda, you addressed in your essay very eloquently some of the different obstacles that tend to confront civil society organizations in particular as they try to engage with AI without necessarily the same resources, right, that private companies or that governments would have, without tools that are designed to really work for their purposes, especially in global majority settings. So what are some of those challenges that you're seeing around civic AI? What steps has Open Knowledge Brasil in particular been taking to overcome those challenges, build more of a community around civic AI, and how can that help us to think about making AI more inclusive?
Yeah, so one of the most successful strategies we implemented in the sense of getting qualified people to work with us are partnerships with universities. So collaborating with academic institutions in several ways, several formats, from institutional partnerships to study groups or a professor working with their students. This can give the organizations access to cutting-edge research and expertise in artificial intelligence technologies, natural language processing, At Open Knowledge Brazil, we've established a program where professors and researchers from diverse fields collaborate with our team to tackle specific civic challenges. So, and work and to applied work in our open source project. So this approach not only enriches academic learning, but also allows students to engage with real world problems and to have a sense of the real challenges projects like that have. So we also have some innovative solutions to problems we have, technical problems we have. So this is a successful strategy. And next, there have always been a strategy to adopt open source code, not only because of the philosophy of that, but also to enable this community collaboration. So not only the open source, the source codes are available, but also the governance around the project itself is open. So we have this strategy for developing leadership and in maintainers community. So attracting different people from different profiles to start being more engaged in the governance of the project. So we leverage a Discord channel, which is a platform that gathers people from mostly technical backgrounds, but we have 1,500 members. So they are also lawyers, journalists, designers. And this community has become a hub for exchanging ideas and knowledge, fostering effective and ongoing collaboration. It reinforces the strategy I mentioned before for academic partnerships, because a significant part of this community is formed by scholars. But finally, I would mention, in also responding to the digital divide thing, the importance of providing free and accessible training. So these training programs can empower individuals to actively contribute to civic AI projects. We've seen people coming from non-technical backgrounds starting to work in the project and gaining more confidence in collaborating and also entering the professional market. We had 500 individuals in our Python for Civic Innovation course in our School of Data, so we can teach programming language. People can contribute to real problems, to real projects. And some of these students became volunteers. So we have these three strategies combined. And more broadly, civic organizations can do their educational strategies also oriented to data literacy, so they can enhance the civic AI ecosystem, not only their own projects, but also contributing to other projects. That's also what we do in our educational program. So in summary, the combination of these partnerships with universities, open source collaboration, and accessible training are some good strategies to overcome lack of technical resources and skilled developers. But we still have some other challenges to overcome, such as lower accuracy in Portuguese language and other non-mainstream languages in the models, the large language models, and the need for investment in infrastructure costs are some of the challenges we still face.
Thanks very much, Fernanda. I think that idea of having entry points to the AI ecosystem, figuring out how those can be made more accessible, is a really intriguing and important piece of your work there. Turning to Dan, so the challenges, some of the challenges that Fernanda mentioned at the end certainly aren't unique to that context, right? In our workshops, we heard a lot about the importance of engaging mindfully with AI, given, the need to compete for talent with much better resourced companies, and just thinking about tools that will work well for specific civil society organizations, given that it's not always the case that adopting the most sort of trendy cutting edge thing, right, is going to meet the specific needs of the organization. So just given the fact that there are lots of different organizations, not just organizations that do tech necessarily, but also civil society groups working on government transparency or human rights, right, that might be thinking about AI as a tool, grappling with ways of incorporating these technologies. What can donors and the wider democracy support community do to help increase capacity building, coordination, and smart experimentation in this space?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Beth. I mean, this is a really great question, and this is something that we think about a lot here at NED, because ultimately our goal is to support our broad network of activists who are not just people working in tech, but doing a whole host of activities related to democratic governance and values, right? I think the first thing that I think of is just like history shows us that, you know, the technology often evolves in unexpected ways. So the printing press was created to reproduce religious texts, but it generated like a revolution in mass communication and education. And so, and just in the same way that some of these new facilities that AI is creating for us, we're going to find new and innovative ways to use them, especially small d Democrats around the world are incredibly ingenious. But that can only happen, getting to the equity question, that can only happen if people have access and are able to explore these tools and also to think about how they're built for those kind of communities in mind. There are three things that I think that donors can do in this space, and I think that we're trying to do. First, we need to recognize that not all CSOs have the resources or knowledge to experiment with AI tools, and we need to find ways to empower those organizations. This can be working with some of the more tech-forward organizations that we have that can really delve in and kind of get their hands dirty in AI and innovate. But it also might be working with groups of technologists who can then be the interface with other types of CSOs who have challenges that they might not know the ways that, for example, structuring data can be useful for their work in anti-corruption, for example, right? So I think we want to, you know, find the different ways that we can reach the broader groups that we're trying to support. Second, donors, I think, can serve as real vital connectors. So at NED, you know, we support 2,000 projects in 100 countries. This means that we often see examples of how something is being used in one context, and we might be able to say, you know, maybe this is something that this other organization elsewhere would want to look at. We also, and I think this is a function that the forum does quite well in the workshops, is connect people across different regions to share that type of knowledge. So I think donors need to also think of themselves not just as providing resources, but also providing that knowledge connection. And finally, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this report is actually just a really good example of that. I really highly encourage people to check out the report. Carl, Fernanda, and Beth's essays are one of the ways that we think about how we can diffuse knowledge and start conversations across regions to think about what are some potential points of effort that we want to focus on and how we can help support our broader partner network.
Thanks so much, Dan. And certainly we would love to see people read the full report. And in fact, perhaps if we could put a link to that in the chat. So I have some last few questions from the Q&A before we wrap up. And I'm going to read these out and then see who on our panel might be interested in addressing them. First, on how AI works for people with disabilities. Really important question. I know there are some potential applications of AI for accessibility, but also some risks around more common AI tools not being designed with that in mind. Strategy for digital AI transformation of civil society and human rights defenders. Dan, I think you got at that a little bit, but if anyone has further thoughts, feel free to jump in. And then open source software, criticism of open source is being actually controlled by the tech companies, and does that matter in the case of Civic AI? And Carl, I know you had a big project on open sourcing AI models, so I might throw that one to you.
Sure. Yes, well, there's kind of two different like developmental strategies currently racing against each other when it comes to AI, and I mean the foundational models themselves. You've got the kind of proprietary strategy, which is, you know, the first wave really of companies that hold the code as intellectual property. And then receive enormous amounts of venture capital funding, really unprecedented amounts of venture capital funding in order to be able to keep funding billions and billions of dollars into creating successive generations of those models. To try and catch up, you've got all of these other kind of models that are emerging that are more open to various degrees. Some are more open in the sense that they actually open source the code. Others will be more open in that they will make the parameters more visible, or that they will facilitate a larger network of researchers or engineers that will work on it. It is not a civic-minded offer, the open source movement in AI. I mean, these are largely also extremely large companies who are trying to catch up with the proprietary models by betting on the fact that open source is going to allow them to move faster. So in that sense, yes, there is very much a worry. This is not Wikipedia. You know, there is very much a worry that open source in a way is being captured and leveraged by profit-seeking, very, very commercially driven companies. My worry around open source, though, is also a little bit different, which is that it makes it extremely difficult to actually control models that are open sourced. So in the UK and across Europe, we're having a very lively, active conversation at the moment around AI governance and especially regulation. EU AI Safety Act, we've got the AI Safety Institute in the UK, and much of the kind of regulatory paradigm that's emerging is basically looking at putting rules in place for the companies that run the models. So they have to run all these tests, and they have to make sure that certain kinds of prompts don't get responded to in certain ways. If you create an AI, a truly open source AI LLM, so one that you can run on your own phone, and like there are actually quite small models that are now emerging, I cannot see how any kind of regulatory intervention will work. Like the only thing that you can do is enforce the law at the user level, but you can't do anything about the companies because you can jailbreak them, you can do all kinds of things. Anyway, that's a whole separate debate, but I think I do agree with the kind of emphasis of the questioner around some level of worry and wariness around around open source and AI and exactly what that's meant to do and exactly what benefits that brings.
Yeah, thanks very much, Carl. I think that's an important case where the kind of democratic direction is not immediately clear. Fernanda and Dan, anything else on the questions from our audience?
I would say, Beth, that one important, really critical issue we have is we have shifted from these models that we could apply data to, like the machine learning models we had, to this kind of models that are inferred or a consequence of big data. So they are mostly opaque, and we are not really sure how they work. So the emphasis should be more and more about data itself. So the data governance should be a concern for any civic innovation agenda working with AI. So I know that this discussion on open source models, I agree with what Carl said, but also it's at least a possibility for more decentralization, since once you have open source in the field, many others are emerging from that. So at least you have a more sense of decentralization once you have open source codes. But also we have to talk more and more about data and data quality, because we have other issues arising from this horizon right now.
I know that we're reaching the end of our time, but I mean, there's two points. One, I think, as Carl alluded to, with the size that these models are shrinking. So what was possible, what was feasible a couple of years ago, only with kind of some of the large foundational models, we are seeing advancements where organizations can run their own kind of bespoke models tailored to the kind of activities that they want to do, even on their own computers and relatively inexpensive servers. So we have to, this is something that we need to think about that has both its positive sides as well as the dangers, as Carl mentioned. I think, and I totally agree with Fernanda about the importance of data governance. Data is at the heart of these foundational models and about AI. And so to ensure that there are safeguards, we really need to think about data itself. And the final thing I would just say is that the tools themselves cannot just solve problems in a vacuum. We need technological innovation paired with political will and political innovation. And I think that's the perspective that we come at it from NED. There is not tech in itself. And I think this goes back to what Chris was saying at the kickoff, right? Where we thought liberation technology, just get the tech, it's going to lead to liberation. Well, we're much wiser in that regard. And so we really need to also think about that political angle of what kind of democratic norms and guardrails do we want societies around the world to create so that these technologies can be leveraged for good.
Thanks, everyone. Some really great points coming up in that last round would underscore the question about the explainability of AI models and the importance of thinking about data and more generally thinking about some of these less glamorous underlying issues, underlying governance challenges that organizations need to address as they think about experimenting with AI tools. So I think this has been a really rich conversation looking at different dimensions of the application of AI in the civic sphere, but also the different challenges of practice and principle that the incorporation of AI technologies raises. I want to thank our fantastic speakers for joining us. Encourage everyone to read the full report, Leveraging AI for Democracy, Civic Innovation on the New Digital Playing Field, which is available at ned.org/ideas, and to follow the forum's continuing work on emerging tech. Thank you for the great questions, and we look forward to seeing you next time.